Teotihuacan, an architectural marvel that was built and flourished and then abandoned even before the Aztecs came through. In fact, the whole name of Teotihuacan was given to us by the Aztecs. They just made it up. We have no idea what the people themselves would have called this place. They had a name for it at all. There is very little evidence that there were ever any kings in Teotihuacan. It seems like these pyramids were built and then abandoned later, and they later devoted themselves to building some really cool housing. I bring this up because it gets us into what I believe are some deep assumptions that we have about weird rituals and who's buried where and what these societies were maybe doing with their stuff. And you may not think you have these deep assumptions, but they come to us, they're very deep in our society. Here's one of them, that the things you can do if you plant crops and agriculture is better than what the hunters and gatherers were doing. And that people who have crops and farms have better lives than hunters and gatherers. Now, we've talked a little bit about this and how this is a little bit problematic because if you look at health and the issues of health, it seems like the hunters and gatherers had better height, better nutrition, generally in some ways healthier than their early farmer counterparts. It's only in recent years that we've had enough food to go around, and that's only in certain societies. It also seems to be true that the more agriculture you have, the more you have to work, the harder it is. So maybe for certain people, their lives got better, but it's this deep assumption that people would naturally want to farm when really it doesn't seem to be the case. We also assume that if there is some city plan, some grid or a pyramid, then there must be somebody telling them what to do. There must be a leader. There must be a hierarchy. There must be some autocrat or some despot making people do things. This is something that we'll talk about directly in this chapter, the idea that human life is always getting more complex, and that it has to get more complex. That's just the way humans are. We make the same assumption about evolution, which is to say, we assume that more and more complex creatures are inevitable. This is not true in evolution. A simpler form can be more well adapted than a complex form. And we still live in the age of bacteria, where the most predominant form of life will be with us long after we are all gone. So the idea that humans or evolution trends toward complexity is something that we'll be questioning. Another deep assumption, you may not realize that this is a deep assumption of our society. It goes back to a philosopher in England about 500 years ago named Thomas Hobbes, who talked about the war of all against all. This is also known as the law of the jungle, or the idea that if we don't have police around or a state government, we're all just going to fight each other because no one will be around to keep us in line. If you don't have the government and the police and the military to keep people in line, they're just all going to kill each other. It's everybody against everybody. Who knows when a simple disagreement turns into a fist fight, turns into a knife fight, turns into a gunfight. That's what will happen if you don't have the police around to keep these people under control. So Hobbes was advocating for a very strong state government to make sure everybody was doing the right thing. Now, we're not here to necessarily disprove these assumptions, but we are here to think about them and to call them into question and to see if they really make sense. Is evolution always getting more complex? Do we really need a state and a police to enforce order, or are there other alternatives? So this part of the chapter 8, is about social organization and how we do get more complex forms than we observed under hunter-gatherers. Your textbook uses some terms that are commonly used in archaeology to designate different forms of social organization: bands, tribes, and chiefdoms. Generally speaking, we think that hunter-gatherers organized themselves into bands. There were also there were lots of kinship ties, family ties, although many bands of hunter-gatherers also included many non-kin as well, and that they were mobile and fairly cosmopolitan and diverse in terms of their membership. But in general, we think that they had smaller groups of people than farmers, who would then organize themselves into what the archaeologists call tribes. Now, in our terminology, in everyday terminology, we usually use the term tribe and the term chiefdom synonymously, but archaeologists distinguish these and would say that there are also these hierarchical chiefdoms which are more pronounced than tribes and generally correspond to more pastoral societies. Now, these terms are okay as a general way of sorting out different kinds of social organization, but I would caution you about several ideas. A lot of people believe that we evolve through each of these stages, but the more evidence we have, it doesn't look like this is a natural evolution. People go back and forth between these organizations. Some people go back and forth between these social organizations seasonally. In the summer, they look more like hierarchical societies, and in the winter, they look more like egalitarian bands. So these don't seem to evolve necessarily into each other. They don't also neatly correspond to different forms of agriculture or different forms of subsistence. And they don't really mean that a society is getting more complex or not. I low-key hate them because they have these popular resonances. They have these associations where we think that tribes have chiefs. I don't like these terms because they tend to give us these notions about how people are organized, and I don't think they correspond very well to reality. But on the other hand, we need to be able to talk about things like how we got to have cities or states. And by states, I don't mean New York State. I mean a government, some overarching central government. So how did we get cities and states? There have been a lot of ideas proposed about this. There has been the idea that you need a state in order to have irrigation. So one of the more famous ideas was that if you had to irrigate crops, you needed some form of a leader in order to make sure the irrigation worked. We've later found that there are societies in the Andes, for example, that have communal irrigation systems. They don't really have a hierarchical system. And other places where states developed that didn't necessarily have much irrigation at all. There's another idea, or sometimes called a theory, the circumscription theory was proposed, which argued that people had a certain resource, maybe it was a harbor or a port, and then you have population growth, and then you have conflict over resources. These groups would organize and have to fight each other. To fight each other, they needed states or governments. In general, as your textbook says, archaeologists have moved away from large universal theories toward more nuanced investigations. That is to say, there are different kinds of cities in different parts of the world. Teotihuacan is not the same kind of city as Tenochtitlan that the Aztecs built. And those are not the same kinds of cities that the Mayas had or the cities that we see in Mesopotamia. So just because you have a city doesn't mean you have exactly the same thing. And it seems like even this idea of a state government is not always the same all over the world. So the point of this is that there's not one story that explains all urban forms or all state governments. One of the things that has been very important, or people have looked a lot at, is the relationship between agriculture, urban life or cities, and what we call social stratification. So social stratification is when you have human groups being organized into different levels. The people on the top, the elite, leaders, and the people on the bottom, the non-elite. Among hunter-gatherers, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of social stratification. You don't have a lot of wealth being able to be concentrated, so people are relatively egalitarian. We see evidence for social stratification around the time that some of these cities emerge, and some of the burials, oftentimes in some of the monumental architecture, like a pyramid, you'll find somebody buried who seems to look like a leader or a king or a queen. In burials, if we find people that are buried with jewels and lavish stuff, it's assumed that they had a status and that they might have been able to pass on that status to their heirs or to their children. We also can see archaeologically evidence for craft specialization. Certain people get to be potters, and other people get to be farmers, and that's all they do. Instead of doing different things, like hunter-gatherers who would have to do a whole bunch of things all during the day, your job is to do one thing. Your job is to hammer nails. And that's what you do all day long. And you start to specialize, and then you trade with the people who are baking bread. Now, in general, stratification is associated with farming and agriculture. Because in hunter-gatherer societies, there isn't a lot of wealth that you can accumulate and store. That said, there are inequalities in some hunting and gathering groups. Oftentimes, especially those who hunted large animals, different weather conditions seem to have gender and other inequality. And some agricultural societies seem to have been relatively egalitarian. They were able to organize themselves in such a way that there wasn't someone taking all the tribute from other people or lording it over other people. Your textbook has an interesting little tidbit here, which is that the largest wealth disparities, or the largest hierarchies that archaeologists have observed, seem to be in societies where there were large draft animals. The cows and the horses, those are the animals that would be considered large draft domesticated animals. It's an intriguing idea. I'm not sure if it's going to be completely proved or not, but it seems to be that in those societies which did depend on these larger animals, they seem to have more disparities in terms of the concentration of wealth and hierarchy. It's interesting where these animals were domesticated, mostly in what is now the Middle East, but spread throughout Eurasia, and where these kinds of very powerful cities and states began to develop. Now, the idea that human societies tend to be more complex. As your textbook has a whole section on it titled Why Human Societies Tend Toward Complexity. As I mentioned, I'm a little bit suspicious of this. Do they really tend toward complexity, or are they done? As an example of this, I'll give you a little meme that was circulating not too long ago of McDonald's from when I was a kid, when they were fun and colorful and complex and a nice place to go, and the McDonald's of today, which are simple, austere, and look like you're in prison all the time and you're just staring at your phone to make sure your order has been delivered. Which is more beautiful? So, do human societies tend toward complexity? There may be some amount in which human societies as a whole have become more complex. There are certainly complex societies. But the other side of this is that if you live in a complex society, your own life can become simpler. So let us say you live in a hunter-gatherer society where you do different things all day long, have to build your own house, you have to hunt your own food, cook your own food. You learn how to do all these things. Whereas if you just learn how to do one thing, hammer nails, then your life in some ways has become simpler than it would have been in times when you weren't socially organized like that. The other funny thing is that in general, the more complex your tools are, the less skill they are required to operate. If you think about one of the simplest tools in the world, a lasso, just a rope, a loop in it. And then you think about if I handed you a lasso and told you to throw it and catch a running reindeer, how long would it take you to learn how to do that? Yeah, quite a while. You probably couldn't do that on your spring break trip to the circumpolar region. Whereas if I hand you the latest iPhone, which is an extremely complex tool, my 3-year-old knows how to use this. It's very easy to use. So, in some ways, we've become button pushers instead of lasso throwers. As your textbook admits, there is no singular reason why human societies trend toward complexity. They sometimes get more complicated and they sometimes get simpler. It's hard to say. There's not one singular reason why this tends to happen. In a complex society, and in any society, we have to somehow coordinate things and maintain order. So your textbook goes into a number of ways in which we govern or administer complex societies. One way is to have formal rules about who does what. What do we call formal rules that are written down? Laws. Laws, things you have to do. These are the things that you're supposed to do or have to do. But in any complex society, the laws do not comprehend all behavior. There are also informal social norms, or ideas about how people should behave. We have found out in recent years that there are a number of expectations about how our elected leaders, like our president, should behave. They are not written in a law. But we've always just assumed that the president wouldn't do certain things. But we found out that those are just social norms that can be broken. But in a lot of cases, we use these. There's not a law that says you should be nice to each other and polite, a law that says you shouldn't hurt each other. But in terms of a lot of our daily interaction, we function according to informal social norms, or ways in which our daily life is organized. And this applies to the notion of justice. We have formal systems of justice where if you break the law, then you are put in a situation of punishment or put in a jail, so you can't break the law anymore. These are formal justice systems. But just like there are informal norms, there are also informal justice systems, ways in which we regulate each other. These are not necessarily enforced through laws, they're not necessarily written down as regulations. So in a society, if someone is breaking the norms, you can do things like shame them or sanction people or keep them out of your group. And these are ways in which we keep people in line or hope they do the right thing by perhaps calling attention to their actions publicly. We talked about how gossip can be a form of social shaming. You don't want to be a subject of gossip, but keeps people in line. All of these things are ways in which we informally organize our society outside of a strict state government. And we'll be talking more as we go into chapter 9, the next part, about the ways in which our food systems and how we trade things around is often organized outside of these hierarchical structures. So if we go back to our deep assumptions, hopefully we've been able to at least tweak these a little bit. The idea that maybe agriculture isn't necessarily that much better or different than hunter-gathering, that people can organize themselves without necessarily having a king or a leader telling them what to do, and that maybe complexity comes and goes. In today's world, I was especially struck by this last idea, that if we didn't have the police or the state or the military around, we'd all be killing each other. I feel like in today's world,
no evidence of that.
there's no evidence of that. In today's world, many of us are probably more worried about being killed by the military than we are that they're keeping us in line.